Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about what I would do if I was the college football commissioner. A lot of more things that I would do if I was that, but at the end of the day, got into a couple of different things here. And Anthony, in terms of the NIL stuff, I totally agree. I do think we need to have some people from the NFL, some people from baseball, some people from just these professional sports to give us a better idea of where to move forward. What I will say is, I do think we need, excuse me, I do think we need certain former players that have played in the NIL era, or at least player activists in that room, because I do think there's a little bit of let's just make the most money, or not necessarily that, but let's just save the most money for these teams. Let's put them in the best position. We got to make sure that the players are getting fairly compensated as well. So a combination of all those guys definitely would be a huge help, and obviously those NFL and MLB and all of those guys would have a much better grasp on all this stuff than we would right now. But let's move forward. First year head coaches were a huge topic of conversation when they were hired, and especially throughout this year. And let's get into this because there were a lot of great head coaches. There were really not too many head coaches that entirely missed the mark this year. There weren't too many guys that walked into their job and just fell on their face. Now, I can make the argument for Brent Brennan down there in Arizona, but we'll talk about some other guys on this one, and we'll start with Sharon Moore. I'm going to give him a B. I think he did a very solid job this year. It was a very weird year for Sharon Moore because the reality is you lose that many guys to the draft, you lose your quarterback, you lose your head coach, your defensive coordinator. You're going to struggle. That's just the reality of that situation. Now, probably didn't need to drop to 7-5. I think there were some issues in the middle of the season that called were a little bit of a problem. I definitely do think some of the quarterback decisions were a little bit out there. I think he probably could have done a better job kind of utilizing Alex Orji and kind of just leaning into who they are a little bit more often. But at the end of the day, he found his way through what was a team that really was terrible offensively, and they found a way to 7 wins. They got the win over Ohio State. They bring in Bryce Underwood, and frankly, it'd probably be a C- on here if that wasn't the case. If they didn't get those two things, big things done, that I would be a little bit more precarious about this one. But overall, he's done a great job. He took over a job where everything was changing. And tons of guys were going off to the NFL. The head coach was leaving. The defensive coordinator was leaving, as was a lot of other staffers on this team. He found a way to stabilize this thing, and that's as best as you can do. It was a very up and down year. You lose to Texas, you beat USC, you get some momentum, you lose to Washington, and it kind of falls off a cliff until the last week of the season. So it's been all over the place for this Michigan team, but I think they finished really strong, and they look like a team going into 2025 that I can trust to at least be in the conversation down the stretch of the season, and it'll be really fun to see what they can do. Bryce Underwood is still a freshman, so I'm going to kind of temper my expectations just a little bit there, but at the end of the day, very, very talented head coach, and definitely a guy that I think is going to do great things in 2025. Curt Cignetti, I give him an A plus as well, if I'm being totally honest. I think he's one of those guys that he did such an incredible job this year. It was a job that Indiana is the losingest program in college football history. It is not one that is used to where they were this year. And a lot of Indiana fans have said, we were talking about, I feel like someone had said college basketball better than college football. I disagree, of course, but there were some Indiana fans that said, I love college basketball, but going through what we just went through, nothing's touching what college football is. And that's what it is. It's incredibly special, and Curt Cignetti brought that to Bloomington this year. So you have a guy that just one of the best motivators in the entire sport. His players play incredibly hard for him and follow him just into the fire every single week. And then you look at all the guys he brought in from JMU, but not even that. You bring Curtis Rourke from Ohio. You bring in CJ West from Kent State, and you make a really, really good group up front. It's a very, very vicious group, and a group that never played like they were an underdog. They never played like they weren't supposed to be on the field. They never played like they were 10 point underdogs. They never played scared, really, throughout the season. Now, the Notre Dame and Ohio State game maybe left a little bit to be desired in certain respects, but overall, it was a remarkable year for this guy, and definitely a guy that I have a ton of respect for, and we'll see what happens in 2025. 2025 is going to be a huge year for him because what happens with replenishing this roster? It's a lot of guys walking out the door now. You still do have a good foothold in this team, but definitely some things that are going to have to be replaced, especially that quarterback and Curtis Rourke. So going to be an incredible thing to watch throughout this offseason, but this year, Curt Cignetti definitely takes the cake for first-year head coaches. Jedd Fisch, I have a B minus here. I think it was one of those years where he was up against it, kind of like Sharon Moore over at Michigan, but almost worse, if I'm being totally honest with you, because you lose Kalen DeBoer and you don't lose him to the NFL, you lose him to another program. So a lot of the guys follow him on over there. You lose a lot of your staff in. You're left in a place where it's Will Rogers to start the season, and then you have Damon Williams Jr. coming in as a freshman, very talented. That's the only gripe I have here. I think he should have started earlier in the season. I think he probably should have pulled the trigger pretty early on. Now, Will Rogers was playing good football, so it's not necessarily to tear down Will Rogers by any respect, but there was a moment in the season where it felt like, okay, Washington's not going to make a run to a CFP spot. They're not necessarily going to be in the Big Ten conversation. Let's just get the guy ready for 2025. And they did that later in the season, but I probably would have done it about halfway home, if I'm being totally honest. But again, a very minor thing that doesn't necessarily change the way I think about Jedd Fisch. And I think when you look at 2025, setting up really nicely. Damon Williams has showed enough to feel confident in him going into next year. The running back room with Jonah Coleman is going to be really, really fun to watch. And the wide receiver room is very talented. With Denzel Boston, you brought in Omari Evans. I think it's going to be a really fun team. I've already talked about them being kind of a dark horse as far as I'm concerned. I think they're going to be really fun in 2025. Anthony, what worries me about Franco is he might leave as a coordinator or a head coach at a bigger program. You know, that makes sense. There are different guys out there that are going to be hard to pin down. And the reality of this business is you're always trying to find your way up. There's no doubt about that. So there's going to be some bouncing around when you talk about a lot of these head coaches and a lot of the staffs around these head coaches. But the best head coaches find a way to reload. You know, Nick Saban had a coordinator taken from him, which felt like every single offseason, and he found a way to rebuild it. I think they're going to be in a position where you'll find out who the great head coaches are compared to the just good head coaches. Moving on to Deshaun Foster here, this is kind of a rather quick one. I just kind of wanted to give a quick shout out to him because he came into a year where UCLA was buried. No one believed that they were going to play well. No one believed that they were going to be even remotely close to competing for anything in the Big Ten, and they weren't, not necessarily. But they also had an unwinnable schedule to start. They played LSU, they played Ohio State, they played Penn State, they played Oregon, they played all these teams that they just weren't beating, plain and simple. It didn't matter what Deshaun Foster did. They were not winning those games. Big changes came throughout the back end of that season, and they did stumble a couple of times in the back end, but the reality was they made a huge amount of strides in. When you look at that team right now, when you look how they operate and how he operates, just feels like one that's going to keep climbing, and at a certain point, you're probably talking about UCLA the same way we're talking about USC and Washington right about now. Fran Brown. This might be one of my favorite head coaches in the country. He is so much fun to watch, and he's done an incredible job over there at Syracuse this year. Finding your way to 9-3, getting that big-time win over Miami to end the year, remarkable. It's an absolutely incredible thing, and it's one of those things that he goes up to Syracuse, and he's the DB coach at Georgia, and he goes up there, and really the only people that were confident that he was going to succeed were Georgia fans, and were Georgia people and people that understood who he was, because the job that he did down there was downright incredible, and it wasn't necessarily, he was absolutely incredible at finding the right talent, or seeing the diamond in the rough, or anything like that. He's just a great motivator. He's a great man. He's absolutely someone that you were willing to follow him into the fire. No matter who the players are behind you, it was going to be very easy to get those guys to love that coach, and it happened very quickly. Kyle McCord succeeded in a lot of respects because of Fran Brown and because of the energy he brings every single day. A lot of the other guys on that team would say the exact same thing. So, remarkable head coach. This was not necessarily a team that when you look down the roster, you said, wow, they got dudes all over the place. They had a lot of potential on that team, no doubt about it, and they got about every little bit of that potential out. Now, you move forward without Kyle McCord, you move on to Ricky Collins likely as your starting quarterback. It'll be interesting to see what he can do in 2025, but I cannot think higher of Fran Brown, and frankly, I think he could be a guy that's taking over a big-time job here in a couple of years. Manny Diaz, I'm going to give a B+ here. Did an incredible job around Duke this year. Getting to 9 wins, you brought in Malik Murphy. Didn't necessarily hit the way that you wanted to, but made plenty of plays throughout the year, and then you played elite defense. That was the way that they were going to win. I think they won what felt like all of their games. If I'm being totally honest, it felt like they won by 3 points overall, but the reality is, remarkable job from him coming in. I think they're in a position now where you just got to build from this. Now, you are changing at quarterback. Darian Mensah's coming in at 2025. Malik Murphy was, I don't want to say pushed out, was ushered out of the building, if I'm being totally honest. Darian Mensah was brought in to be their quarterback. Very talented quarterback. I'm a little bit surprised that they pulled the trigger there, but at the end of the day, very talented quarterback that can do some great things for them. But Diaz is a guy that I think he's going to be awesome. I think he's going to continue to be in these positions where he's going to be a really hard out every single year. And maybe if he can hit another one next year, maybe he finds another big job. He had that one down in Miami, did not go the way that he wanted it to, but at the end of the day, be able to bounce back, maybe get, I don't necessarily want to say which job because I'm not sure which ones are going to be opening, but a very, very good first year. I think it's going to develop into a really fun 2025. Anthony's got a couple of questions here. That is the big question with Fran Brown is sometimes you will see these guys go to a school, have some early success for whatever reason, depending on if it's the veteran quarterback or some different things around there, and then they'll make the big time jump. They'll go to a big time SEC school like an Auburn. Let's just say Fran Brown makes his way down to Auburn and Hugh Freeze gets fired after this year. Then it gets a little bit too much. So it is a tightrope walk in the world of college football. I think the best example that I have is Charlie Strong over at Louisville. Did an incredible job and did awesome and definitely did great things there. Then you take over Texas, and it's a totally different ball game. There's a million different things to deal with. So that is definitely something to think about. Now, what I will say is Fran Brown is from the Kirby Smart tree. He's going to be able to handle those people. There's no doubt about that. So I have a little bit higher hope there, but it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. Yeah, absolutely. I do want to see what happens in that recruiting cycle, and definitely I do want to get into that recruiting cycle just a little bit later in the week, so maybe we'll take an early view on that and kind of see where all the top end guys might end up going. So we'll get into that in time, but Mike Elko is the other guy here. He did a great job here. It wasn't perfect by any means. I mean, you start 7-1 and 5-0 in SEC, you finish 8-5 and 5-3 in SEC. That's not what you want to happen by any means. You lose to South Carolina, you lose to Texas to finish off the season, and you're left there wondering, and you're left there trying to figure out, is this just another 8-4 coach that we're just going to ride for another 5 years, or is it a guy that set a foundation? Is it a guy that's going to continue to build? Now, you look in the early parts of the offseason, they've done a great job filling in the wide receiver position, making sure they're in the best position possible going into 2025. The reality is this one's going to come down to 2025. I think he did a solid job in this year. I think he tapered off at the end. He's got to take it up a notch in 2025, or A&M fans are going to be thinking the same exact thing they were thinking about Jimbo Fisher early on in his tenure was, man, is he ever going to get past 8 wins? Is he ever going to get past 9 wins? And he barely did. So that's going to be something to watch, no doubt about it. I really like Mike Elko, and I think he's going to continue to go forward because the reality is I think he's done an incredible job. And you say it right here, Anthony. It's a relative incomplete right now. You never really know what this program is going to be, especially Texas A&M, until this guy gets into his second, third year. I think they're going to be in a position where they're going to be really successful, and it's going to fit what Mike Elko likes to do a little bit more. And then the man of the hour, Kalen DeBoer, the guy that was talked about probably more than any human on planet Earth around those 2 days when Nick Saban retired and he took over that job. And it's been a weird year more than anything else. It's been very, very weird. It's been all over the place, and he's missed in a number of places that he has to hit. He's hitting a couple of places really aggressively that I don't think everyone expected him to hit. So it's a very confusing conversation. I'll be totally honest with you. So the big thing here is this team coming into the year had an offensive line that looked absolutely forceful. They had Tyler Booker, they had Jaden Roberts on the interior of that line, they had Parker Brailsford. It looked like a group that could impose their will. It looked like a group where they were going to run the ball 40 times a game, they were going to be able to control the clock, and that was what they were going to do the entire year. That didn't end up happening. The offense was essentially, can Jalen Milroe make a superhero play? If not, we're in trouble. That's the reality of this offense, and it was kind of the reality of the situation he was in. You come into a room where Jalen Milroe is the outright leader of that team. And if you watch the USF game when he was benched by Nick Saban, that's not the same team. This team essentially quit in that game, respectfully to all of those players. Essentially kind of just tapered back in that game and said, we're not playing hard. If it's not Jalen out there, Jalen had to be out there, one way or the other. And it kind of came back to bite him in some respects, but also, what else are you going to do? It's just one of those situations where he came into a team that wasn't fully his and they had a very clear leader. He's going to follow that, at least for year one. Now, 2025 is going to be the year, and unreal expectations will follow him to that. I can absolutely promise you that. So the reality was, I've talked about this before, some of this was going to happen with Saban at the helm or with not Saban at the helm. You have so much stuff that's going towards teams just not being as dominant as they were before. This was going to happen. One way or the other, this was going to happen to Alabama. it's obviously something they're not used to, and it's obviously a different face than Nick Saban, which makes things just that little bit tougher. I think he did a solid job this year. Considering everything that was around there, considering all the issues, I think he did an okay job. Now, you got to do better than that next year. I don't think anyone's going against that, and I think you got to make it the CFP. There's no doubt about that. We'll see what happens. I think he's going to do a whole lot better of a job in year 2. But then you have guys like Brent Brennan, very tough year at Arizona. Then you have Bill O'Brien at BC that I think is going to do a great job next year. Willie Fritz the exact same. Jonathan Smith might take a little bit of time up there at Michigan State, but really like what he can do. And then Jeff Lebby, a guy that loaded up in the portal this time around, and I think it might take a couple of years, but they could really hit the ground running in 2026. But let's take our second break here. And when we come back, let's talk about the teams with the most to prove in 2025. We did 8 teams yesterday. I got 8 more teams for you today. So stick with us, and we'll be right back to break down that.